Hello and welcome to another NGen Math 7 lesson by eMathInstruction. My name is Kirk Weiler and today we're going to be doing Unit 2, Lesson 12 on working with signed numbers on the calculator. Now this is our last lesson in this particular unit, and all throughout we've been trying to give you a basis for how to think about adding signed numbers, subtracting them, multiplying them, dividing them, raising them to exponents, simplifying fractions that have negatives and positives in them, and those are really, really important. Throughout high school mathematics, into college and further, it's going to be very important for you to understand why signed numbers work the way they do. But let's be honest about it, right? If I'm going to do something like negative 452 times positive 57, I'm likely going to use my calculator to do it. So we want to make sure that you know how to use your scientific calculators, where the negative button is on your scientific calculator, and how to enter things on the calculator with negatives and positives to get the right answers. So that's what we're going to be working on today. Make sure you've got your scientific calculators ready and good to go. We're going to be using a Texas Instruments scientific calculator in our work, but you should be able to use basically any one of them, probably including some that are on your phones. All right, so let's get right into it in the first exercise. All right, and in your worksheet, I've got this like little generic picture of a calculator, but I'm going to bring up our Texas Instruments calculator right now. All right, and of course the first thing that you want to do before you jump in and do signed number work on the calculator is figure out where the negative button is. On most calculators, it tends to be right down here. On this calculator, it's right about here. Now, it is very important to distinguish between the negative button and the subtraction button. It would be very, very easy, given that the two symbols are nearly identical and obviously quite related, as we've seen in this unit, to think that you could just use the subtraction button instead of the negative button. But you really, really can't. When you're dealing with negative numbers and there's a negative attached to a number, make sure to use that button. And most of the time, the negative button will be in parentheses. So that's how you'll know that it's different than the subtraction button, okay? Very, very critical. But let's take a look at exercise number 1 and see what we're going to be doing today. Find the negative button on your calculator. Then evaluate each of the following expressions first without your calculator, and then check your results with your calculator. All right, so let's do a few of these together and then we'll have you do some on your own. And again, this is good practice to think about negatives and positives without a calculator and then verify the results using the calculator. So like letter A, right? Negative 14 plus 6. Right from the get-go, we've been thinking about how negatives and positives cancel when we add. Because we've got more negatives than positives, we should have a negative final answer. And in fact, we should have negative 8. All right. On the calculator, of course, what I want to do is I want to hit my negative button. I'm going to then type in 14. Then I'm going to put plus 6, hit an enter, and there's my answer, negative 8. So the idea is I can now put a nice big check mark there. Okay? Likewise, right, if I have 0 minus 10, depending on how you want to think about that, you can think about that as 0 plus negative 10. You can think about being at 0 on the number line and then moving 10 units to the left so that you're now at negative 10. Either way, 0 minus 10 without a calculator, we should know is negative 10. Now on the calculator, I'm just going to hit the clear button. Here I'm going to do literally 0 minus 10. I'm not going to use the negative button at all because that is subtraction there. And look at that. I get an answer of negative 10. So that checks as well. All right. What I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to do C, D, E, F, G, and H, right? The next 6 problems, leave that kind of final row that's a little bit more complicated. You can leave those, we'll do those together. But I'd like you to do the next 6 on your own. Again, do them by hand. They're all relatively easy problems. Then go back and check your answers using your calculator. Pause the video now and take a few minutes to do this. All right, well, letters C and letter D could be a little bit confusing because they mix subtraction with negative numbers. 9 minus negative 7, as we all know, right? We can change that into 9 plus 7, which should give us a value of 16. On the calculator, right, I literally can put in, well, actually, let me hit clear so it's all kind of cleared out there. I can hit 9 minus -7. I don't have to put that -7 in parentheses. And I get positive 16. Awesome. Over here, where I have -5 minus -8, I could change that into -5 plus positive 8, which should give me a net positive 3, but let's check it out on the calculator. Again, hitting out the clear button, if I have -5 minus -8, enter, I'll get positive 3. Now, if you're bothered on the calculator that I'm not putting the -8 in parentheses, put it in parentheses, right? Here, let me do that one again, but with the -8 in parentheses. It certainly doesn't hurt. -5 minus parentheses -8, right? If you really want to make it look the way you want it to look, there it is. Now, one last thing. What if I kind of mess up and I don't use the negative button, I use the subtraction button? What happens if I do something like this? Whoop, oh, I just tried to put in -5, that didn't work. Let me actually use the -5 button, right? Let's say I then did minus, right, -8, right? It gives me a syntax error, right? It's trying to minus and subtract again, subtract. You know, that's just not going to work. A syntax error means that you gave the computer something in a foreign language that it doesn't understand. Oh, what does that mean? That's what a syntax error is. So be careful to distinguish between the subtraction button and the negative button. Let's do a few more. And actually, let's do this. Let's rip out E, F, G, and H by hand, and then we'll do them on the calculator. So for instance, letter E, -8 times +5. Well, we know a negative times a positive is a negative, and specifically, that's going to be -40, right? Here, where we have -9 times -6, a negative times a negative is a positive, so it should be positive 54. Letter G, and again, we'll do these on the calculator in just a moment. Letter G, -24 divided by 3, right? A negative divided by a positive will give me a negative, and in this case, it should give me -8. And finally, -32 divided by -8, a negative divided by a negative should be a positive, and that should be a positive 4. So let's check them really quick on the calculator. Let me clear out my syntax completely and utterly. All right, let's do -8 times 5, and I get -40. Awesome. Let me clear that out, and let me do -9 times -6, and I get positive 54. Awesome. Let's bring it down to here. Let me clear this out. Let me do -24 divided by positive 3, and I get -8. Awesome. And finally, clear that out. -32 divided by -8, enter, and I get positive 4. And, you know, I should do my due diligence and check off the fact that I checked each one of those. All right. Let me just move this out of the way real quick. So let's do the last ones, sum them together. So I want I, which is -7 squared. Then I've got -10 cubed, -3 times 5 minus 12, and 15 minus 2 times 8. So again, what you want to do is do all of these by hand, okay? And then we want to check them on the calculator. And again, let's take a look at this one. This one can be very dicey, right? -7 squared. We all know that that's -7 times -7, which should be a positive 49. Now again, you've got to be very careful on your graphing calculator, not your graphing calculator, your scientific calculator. Because if I just do this, -7 squared, I get -49. Now we looked at this a few lessons ago when we were raising negative numbers to powers. Anytime you're raising a negative number to a power, make sure you put it in parentheses. Otherwise, this gets interpreted as 7 squared that then gets multiplied by a -1, okay? So that ends up being -49. It's certainly certainly that should be a positive 49. And in order to get that positive 49, let me delete this out, we've got to have that negative 7 in parentheses. And once we've got it in parentheses, then the calculator knows what we're talking about is negative 7 times negative 7, and then it knows that a negative times a negative is a positive. All right? So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to try to work out what J, K, and L are on your own without a calculator, and then use your calculator to check your answers. Pause the video now and take a few minutes to do that. All right, let's go through it. So what do we got? On letter J, we have negative 10 to the third, which is going to be negative 10 times negative 10 times negative 10. Now, negative 10 times negative 10 is positive 100. Then times negative 10 again will be negative 1,000. So without using my calculator, I should have negative 1,000. Let's take a look. I've got parentheses, negative 10 raised to the third. Remember, let's talk about this for a second. You know, when you're just squaring something, raising it to the second power, there often is an actual button for squaring. But when you're raising things to other powers, oftentimes you have to use this button called a caret button. So it's this little button that looks like this, and this basically means raised to this power. So I have negative 10 raised to the third, and when I hit enter, I get negative 1,000. Now the last two problems here, they're a little bit more complicated expressions, right? Here, I would literally have to figure out what 5 minus 12 is, and that's a negative 7. And then a negative 3 times a negative 7 is a positive 21. So hopefully you got that just by using order of operations. But we can literally put that entire calculation in the calculator pretty much exactly the way it looks. In other words, I can put in negative 3, parentheses, 5 minus 12, parentheses, enter, and look at that, nice positive 21, right? So if I don't want to take the time, or I don't have the time to kind of work through this expression, but I'm allowed to use my calculator, very nicely done. Let's do that last problem, where we've got 15 minus 2 times 8. Keep in mind, order of operations says we must do the 2 times 8 first. 2 times 8 is 16, and 15 minus 16, be careful, is negative 1. All right, so let me bring this thing right over here. Let me clear it out. 15 minus 2, parentheses 8, parentheses, equals negative 1. Man, I like calculators, right? But of course, calculators have their downsides, especially in something like this, right? Where it would be very understandable to just hit negative 7 squared, and then it gives me an answer that I should realize is just completely wrong, because what we saw in an earlier lesson was anytime I raise a negative number to an even exponent, the output, right, the result, should be positive. All right, let's move on and look at some more complex expressions that we can evaluate by hand and then use the calculator to help us check. All right, let me move this puppy out of the way. Exercise number 2. Find the value of each expression first without using your calculator. Then type the entire expression into the calculator carefully to check your work. All right, so let's talk about this. Letter A, letter B both just have something to do with order of operations. So given that we just had a huge homework assignment on that, what I'd like you to do is pause the video now, try to work out what your answers are to A and B, and then let's use the calculators to check those answers. Pause the video now. All right, let's go through them. Well, letter A doesn't look too bad, but keep in mind what we've got is we've got this product, negative 12 times negative 5, and we've got this product, negative 3 times positive 7. So we're going to figure out those products first, and right at the end we'll do the subtraction. Negative 12 times negative 5, a negative times a negative is a positive, and specifically 12 times 5 is 60, right? Minus. Now, negative 3 times negative 7. Well, negative times a positive is a negative, and 3 times 7 is 21, so that will be a negative 21. Then, since I'm subtracting a negative, I can turn it into adding a positive, and we should get 81 as our final answer. I love having the calculator in a situation like this, right? Because even for somebody that literally eats, breathes, and sleeps math, right? The plain fact is I can make mistakes. So it's wonderful, right, to be able to have a calculator like this and be able to type this expression in and see if it's really equal to 81. So let me do that. Now I'm going to literally type it in almost exactly the way it works. I'm going to have parentheses, negative 12, parentheses, negative 5, minus, parentheses, negative 3, parentheses, 7. And I realize we start to lose a little bit in terms of the screen. When I hit enter, I get 81. Awesome check. Now, letter B. This is a bit more of a complex expression because it involves exponentiation and some more parentheses work and things like that. Remember, order of operations would say, well, I've really got to work out the 4 minus 7 first. All right, that's fine. So I'll leave the 12 alone. Maybe I'll leave the 5 to the second alone. And I'll just figure out that 4 minus 7 is negative 3. Right? Then order of operations. Whoa, man. All of a sudden, my board started to blow up. Order of operations says that we should do that exponent next, right? 5 times 5 is 25. So I'll just do that. Then the order of operations would say to me, you should really do that multiplication next. So, great. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Maybe I'll put that in parentheses. And finally, maybe I'll change this to 12 plus negative 25 plus negative 6. Maybe I'll combine those two negative numbers. I'm running out of room here. Negative 25 and negative 6 is negative 31. And then I believe that's all equal to negative 19. All right, so let's verify this now on the calculator. Watch how simple it is to put all of it in the calculator. Here we go. 12 minus 5 raised to the second power plus 2 times 4 minus 7, enter, negative 19. All right. The only problem with the calculator, quite frankly, is that you might become overly reliant on it. All right, I was a high school teacher for a long time, and I saw people after a while with the calculator who would be doing things like 7 plus 2 on it, right? Because it's easy, right? It literally stores all the kind of facts that we've ever learned about math on this little device. The problem is it's important for us to have a number sense. It's important for us, not because we're going to be stranded on a desert island without a calculator. Quite frankly, if I'm stranded on a desert island, I'm going to be worried about more things than a calculator, right? I'm going to wonder if the coconuts are edible and how to get one open. But at the end of the day, we need to have number sense. Number sense is extremely important, which is why calculators are wonderful for checking our work. Anyway, let's go on and use the calculators a little bit more for some other operations. All right, now, operations that involve sort of larger fractions like this, those can be a little bit tricky to enter in on the calculator. So what we want to do in exercise number 3 is, given this expression, we first want to evaluate it without using the calculator like we've been doing. Then we want to check our answer by using the calculator. But the key is, when we have a fraction like this, the calculator really doesn't know that. And so it's important for us to put sort of the numerator and denominator in parentheses. And I'll show you how to do that on the calculator in just a moment. But pause the video now, and just like we did in the last lesson's homework, try to work out what the value of this expression should be equal to. Take a few minutes to do that. All right, let's do it. So I'm going to work on that numerator. Maybe I'll figure out what that exponent is first. 6 squared is going to be equal to 36 minus 5 times 3. Maybe in the denominator, I'll figure out what the 3 minus 10 is just right away. 3 minus 10 is negative 7, right? In the numerator, then, I'm going to have that 36 minus 5 times 3, which is 15, all divided by negative 7. 36 minus 15 is equal to 21, and then I've got it divided by negative 7. And finally, a positive divided by a negative is going to be a negative, and 21 divided by 7 is 3. So hopefully, if I've done everything right, I get a negative 3. Now, the thing that's challenging about these kind of expressions on the in a calculator is that you must enclose the entire numerator in parentheses and the entire denominator in parentheses because they are truly grouped together. We just don't normally need the parentheses when we write the expression like this because we know the numerator is, its own thing and the denominator it says is its own thing, but the calculator wouldn't know that necessarily. So let's take a look at how we put this thing in on the calculator, all right? I'm going to clear that out. I'm going to put a parentheses for my numerator. I'm going to do 6 squared minus 5 parentheses 3. And again, let me just step back for a moment and talk about this, right? It can get a little confusing because all of that is the numerator. I've got a parentheses, 6 squared minus 5 times 3 and another parentheses. Now I'm going to hit divided by, and now in the denominator, I'm going to also, this is a little bit easier, I'm going to have that 3 minus 10 in parentheses. I hit enter, and there's my answer of -3. All right? Now again, what's a little bit tricky about this thing, let me see if we can just get this thing to be a little bit bigger, or maybe that was the size it was. Let's go large right there. We can see that -3 a little bit better on the screen, right? The key here is that we must enclose the entire numerator in parentheses and the entire denominator. Our calculator is not smart enough to know what is the numerator and what is the denominator. Let's look at one more issue when it comes to calculators and fractions that's actually kind of cool. All right, exercise number 4. Consider the expression 5 squared minus 2 squared divided by 8 times 2 minus 5. Evaluate this without the calculator. All right, so I'd like you to do this, and spoiler alert, the answer is going to come out to be a negative fraction. Okay, a negative fraction. So what I'd like you to do is work through your order of operations. Don't be touching the calculator. Just work through this without the calculator and figure out what negative fraction that's all equal to at the end. Pause the video now and go ahead and do that. All right, well, I'm going to put this thing down here at the bottom of the screen so that we can see this a little bit better. Here we go. I'm going to do those exponents, I think, in the numerator right away. I'm going to have 5 squared, which is going to be 25. 4 squared, which is going to be 4. In the denominator, I think I'll probably do that 2 minus 5 right away. That's going to be -3. Now in the numerator, I can do the subtraction. 25 minus 4 is equal to 21. In the denominator, I can do 8 times -3. Since I have a negative times a positive, it's going to be a negative, which is -24. Now, since I have a positive 21 divided by a -24, the overall result should be a negative. And I can simplify that fraction by dividing both the numerator and the denominator by 3. And that's going to give me a final fraction of -7/8. All right. Now the question is, what happens when we put it in on the calculator? And again, this can be quite challenging on the calculator because of all the parentheses use. So let's kind of do it together. Right, here we go. In the numerator, I want to enclose that in parentheses, so I'm going to do parentheses 5 squared minus 2 squared, so that's the top of the fraction, divided by, now here's where it can get very weird looking, because I'm going to have parentheses 8, parentheses 2 minus 5, and another parentheses. I hit enter, and it gives me a decimal. Now, some calculators will just immediately give you a fraction. But here what it's done is it's given me the decimal version of the fraction -7/8. Literally, the answer here is -0.875. Now, some calculators, not all scientific calculators, but most scientific calculators actually have an option on it which will allow you to convert a decimal into a fraction. Isn't that cool? Now you might ask, is there a place that will convert a fraction into a decimal? Yeah, that's called the division button. So in other words, if I want to know what the fraction 1/2 is as a decimal, it's 0.5, but I could literally just do 1 divided by 2, right? But there is a button on this calculator, it's kind of small, it's right here above the table button, that has a little F with a kind of something that looks like this. And that literally means convert a fraction into a decimal or a decimal into a fraction. And all I have to do right now is hit second and hit that button. and it's going to take the number negative 0.875 and it's going to convert it into a fraction. I hit enter, and look at that, negative 7/8. And that's, by the way, kind of a cool thing to have on your calculator regardless. So I mean, here we're just looking at it in the context of, oh, I've got this messy expression, I get a decimal, maybe I want it in its fraction version, so I use that to convert it. But that's kind of nice. I mean, like, it will literally take any decimal you want and convert it into a fraction. So for instance, if I had something like the fraction 0.25, which we should all know what fraction that's equal to, and I turn it into a fraction, it tells me 1/4, right? It's really quite nice. You can even use that button if you're struggling adding fractions. For instance, if I had something like I wanted to add the fraction 1/2 plus the fraction 1/3, right? I should be able to do that, getting a common denominator and things like that. But if I do 1/2 plus 1/3, I get 0.83333 repeated. If I then ask my calculator to nicely turn that into a fraction, it tells me 5/6. I know it's kind of small on the screen. I apologize for that. But it's a really nice tool on your calculator. If you've got it, it's a great use to turn a decimal into a fraction. That fraction, at least on the calculator, looks like this, but is truly just the answer we got above, negative 7/8. It's a great thing to have, if your calculator has it. All right, let's wrap it up. So today, we didn't learn anything new about negative and positive numbers other than where to find the negative sign on your calculator. All right, then we did a lot of practice in terms of just some review of, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing signed numbers, and then how to enter those properly on your calculator. Two things you want to be careful about are when you raise a negative number to a power, make sure that negative number is in parentheses. As well, anytime that you're trying to evaluate a complicated expression involving a fraction bar, make sure both the numerator and the denominator are in parentheses when you put them into your calculator. We'll get a lot more use with our calculators as time goes on, not just in this course, but in Math 8 and also in high school. All right? For now, I just want to thank you for joining me for another NGen Math 7 lesson by eMathInstruction. My name is Kirk Weiler, and until next time, keep thinking and keep solving problems.